Stanford University.
Welcome. Welcome to Stanford Medicine's 10th Annual Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It is my delight and honor to introduce today's speaker, Netanel Miles-Yépez. He will be speaking to us on From Chauvet Cave to Star Wars, Art, Myth, and a Spiritual Futurism. Netanel Miles-Yépez is an artist, philosopher, religion scholar, and spiritual teacher. He is co-founder of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life in dialogue with all the world's great wisdom traditions. Netanel studied history of religions at Michigan State University and contemplative religion at the Naropa Institute before pursuing traditional studies with such spiritual luminaries as Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, founder of the Jewish Renewal movement, and Father Thomas Keating, founder of Contemplative Outreach. He is the author of The End of Religion and Other Writings, published in 2023, and the translator of My Love Stands Behind a Wall, a translation of the Song of Songs and Other Poems, published in 2015. Currently, Netanel lives in Boulder, Colorado, where he is visiting professor in the Department of Wisdom Traditions at Naropa University. Join me in warmly welcoming Netanel.
Thank you. I've been a little under the weather, so I've prepared my remarks on the screen so I can share them with you from there. And I've prepared a little slideshow to go along with it. And so be patient with me as I navigate both. As you can see from Star Wars, I'm going to start in a Star Wars manner. A long time ago, in a galaxy of 200 billion stars, a small blue planet orbiting a single star formed from a nebulous swirl, its atmosphere and oceans the product of volcanic eruptions and outgassing, water vapor pooling in craters and asteroids, which brought their own ice to melt and mix with it there. That's how we got our planet. A billion years after that, we're told, life emerged. Over 3 billion years of slow evolution follow. So here's our galaxy and our little point within the galaxy. We're on one spiral arm, 2/3 of the way through the galaxy. And now we're getting to our slow evolution. In this time, we're growing massive reptiles that dominate the surface of the planet. Reptiles that only go extinct, that are to go extinct amid atmospheric changes and catastrophic meteoric events approximately 66 million years ago, leaving smaller mammals, lizards, birds, and insects to inherit the Earth. Then, just over 3 million years ago, an ancestor evolved that we might begin to recognize, the one to which we reach back and call Homo, a user of stone tools, growing in cranial capacity and walking upright. Still, most of the next 3 million years pass in a kind of brutality we can hardly distinguish. 3 million years of evolution follow, and just a paltry 300,000 years ago, something new arrives in Africa. Us, what we call Homo sapiens, the wise human. And we're described as a hunter-gatherer with complex cooperative family and social structures, curious and inventive, evolving tools for expression and survival, languages, art, technology, religion, and passing on knowledge in ways our Neanderthal cousins and competitors did not. So the Latin homo means human. And we think of that as us, Homo sapiens. But as I already noted, there were once actually many other humans on the planet. Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits. But we, and this is interesting to me, there were many humans, but we're the only humans left today. All our diverse human cousins having long since died out. And I wonder, given the fact that they died out, what will become of us now, Homo sapiens? Here, as we seem to be on the precipice of our own existence on this planet, a planet being pushed by us to a destructive response that might make it uninhabitable to us in the future. In 1735, the Swedish taxonomist Carl von Linné, or Linnaeus as we tend to call him, coined the term Homo sapiens in a work called Systema Naturae. And he probably meant to suggest by that we are the knowledgeable human, the smart ones, as opposed to our less sophisticated evolutionary cousins. Nevertheless, despite this knowledgeable human, the Franciscan monk and philosopher Bonaventure points out that the Latin word sapientia, actually points to a particular type of knowledge. Not knowledge as information, but looking at the words that are connected to sapientia, like sapor, taste, and sapere, which means knowing, it suggests that sapientia actually concerns a tasted knowledge, wisdom, or life experience, as opposed to mere information. Hence, Homo sapiens is not merely a repository of that information, but implies the wise human, or at least the possibility of wisdom. And this is my real interest here. Our possibility in the universe, our capacity for wisdom and survival, which is competing with our equally great proclivity for destructive short-term self-interest and folly. We may destroy ourselves. Recently, a lot of people have been resurrecting the famous astronomer and cosmologist Carl Sagan's seemingly prescient remarks written shortly before his death in 1996. So Carl Sagan warns of a time when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few, and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues. When the people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority, when clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, this is him, not me, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what is true, we slide, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness. He's suggesting that we are on a path of increasing fragmentation, being spoon-fed a corporate media-driven technological virus, which is collapsing conscious thought into pre-digested and pre-packaged units of cultural information on various complex subjects. In his words, simplifying substantive content into a kind of lowest common denominator thinking. And what this is doing is subverting our conscious consent and ultimately creating cults of ignorance and a kind of core susceptibility to terrifying levels of groupthink. Sagan called it a kind of celebration of ignorance that we're falling into. Not so long ago, I saw a large truck with a sticker in the window. And the sticker was illustrating just a big cloud of smoke emanating from a cartoonish version of the same truck I was looking at. And that cloud of smoke was enveloping a coughing planet Earth. And underneath it, it read, "Diesel and proud." Now, this is the kind of celebration of ignorance Sagan seems to be talking about. And the question is, how did we get here? And how might we escape the fate of such a people bent on self-destruction? You know, Homo sapiens, wise humans? Clearly not yet. The knowledgeable human, technologically sophisticated but immature, is competing successfully with the potentially wise human. That's to say, we're engaged in a battle over the meaning of our species and the very course of our evolution. In a relatively recent development for us, and yet bringing with it a sense of urgency, this is the moment that the philosopher and paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin called convergence. For, you know, we've only been around for 300,000 years. So for the 300,000 years, this potentially wise human, birthed in Africa, just 50,000 years ago, began a series of forays out of Africa, kind of conquering the planet, branching out and pursuing separate lines of development, creating disparate cultures, religions, language, technologies, and art of an astounding array. And this he calls divergence. So we go from a point in Africa, and then we spread out in these lines of development. And what he says is basically, on a round planet of limited surface area, it's inevitable that these independent lines of development would one day converge or meet. And not just the cultures existing side by side, but cultures that had perhaps in 50,000 years never met. Cultures whose ways seemed incompatible and utterly unlike one another. And this is what we've had: highly individualist and technological cultures meeting again relational cultures who had remained close to nature and the earth, kind of meeting in the colonialist project, you know, in the last 150 years with near catastrophic results for the latter. Here's our truck. Divergence and convergence, you know, we have a limited surface area. We were bound to meet again, and we did. And it's been problematic for us. I think, even though colonialism and that convergence led to the near eradication of indigenous peoples, I think we still have a moment in this convergence period to learn the lessons of convergence. Those people were not completely eradicated. The results are terrible, but we still have a moment to learn from one another, to share what each line of development knows, so that we might take the best of all into the future. When the modern technological society met the indigenous, it met its own past and had the opportunity, mostly lost, as I'm saying, to witness itself in another life and to see something that it had lost along the way. It was offered a key to unlock the understanding of how we had lived most of our human existence, prior to the agricultural revolution at least, which is approximately 13,000 years ago. But the existence that we lived before that, which has sometimes been characterized without romanticism as superhuman, for the feats we once accomplished, In that period before 13,000 years ago, it's fairly certain that we did superhuman things. We crossed oceans in small boats. We conquered mountains without equipment. We survived nearly unendurable climactic shifts. We were on the very edge of all our potential. So the people that we were then in that period between 50,000 years ago and 13,000 years ago are reflections of ourselves that we must know in order to create our future. So I want to reach back into the consciousness of our collective indigeneity, past our current agriculturally based societies and religions. Like almost everything we know about society and religion today comes from the agricultural revolution. I want to bypass it. Bypass the warring differences between religions and societies to witness ourselves without the filter and the static of too much information. To stand in the immediacy of contact with the art and artifacts of our ancestors and with their apparently collective myth as found throughout the caves of the period that's called the Upper Paleolithic, where perhaps we'll see what we've known, a collective myth, and know it again, that we may take it with us into the future. Indeed, in some ways, I think it might tell us our future or pave the way to it. Now, it's been said that the earliest evidence of mythological thinking is associated with graves, with burial sites. So let me start just a little earlier than the caves of the Upper Paleolithic, in a burial chamber in the Middle Paleolithic. In a mountain called Jebel el-Kafsa, which in Arabic means the mountain of the leap, near Nazareth in the lower Galil in what is today Israel, there's a rock shelter with a burial chamber or a number of burial chambers dating to about 100,000 years ago. In one of those chambers, what is technically called Kafsa 11, excavated in 1971, was found a dead adolescent of about 12 or 13 years old. Its sex unknown, we can't tell, with evidence of a long-healed cranial trauma. And I'll bring up the picture. Now, that cranial trauma did not cause this person's death, though it certainly caused brain damage. The adolescent was buried in a pit dug in the bedrock, arranged in a seemingly significant pose. It's a little hard to tell now the way it's collapsed, but it's been extrapolated to understand how it would have originally looked. The skeleton, perhaps smeared with red ochre in a kind of paste, is lying on its back, with its legs bent to the side, and both hands placed on either side of its neck. And in its hands are the antlers of a large red deer, which was then indigenous to the area. Red ochre is found near the body and on stone tools found nearby. So, what does this all mean? This is 100,000 years ago. These are obviously early funerary practices, but that hardly begins to explain what the significance of this burial and the precise arrangement of the body, the significance of the deer antlers, placed as if to rest on the head, and the meaning of the red ochre. Not to mention the fact that the child had lived with a significant brain injury for years and had not been discarded, and is even buried years later with ceremony, a ceremony that requires significant effort After all, it's a stone burial chamber. They had to dig this into the rock. What does that say about us as a people? Who we were, who we are, and that, despite the inaccurate characterizations of natural selection as survival of the fittest, that was added later. That was not Darwin. There's significant evidence that we took care of one another in a ritual manner. And while we can't speak definitively of the meaning with regard to a burial like this, we just don't know. We're just looking at archaeological evidence. Nevertheless, some of its significant features are not unknown to us. In many ways, it seems to be a 100,000-year-old precursor to artifacts we will see occur again and again in later periods. The deer antler crown, perhaps most famously depicted within the Gundestrup cauldron, almost 100,000 years later. Let me show you that. We'll see again and again antlered heads of human figures. This is perhaps the most famous depiction of that. Or horned heads, human heads with horns. We could speculate that the antlers suggest renewal because the deer loses the antlers and regrows them. And that would make a lot of sense in a burial setting, hoping for the renewal. And they may suggest a relationship to a primary food and inspiration source, the red deer. And even perhaps the red ochre paste that is found there may have connection to the red deer, the redness. We don't know exactly. But ochre itself was significant to us, of major significance. So ochre, which is well familiar to the artist, is a clay earth pigment, a mixture of ferric oxide and various amounts of clay and sand that can range in color. I mean, I saw it outside the house today on my walk, in a yellow form. So it can vary from yellow to orange, to brown, to red, to black. And there's evidence in Africa for the processing and use of red ochre pigments dated back to around 300,000 years ago. Well, that's the date of the emergence of Homo sapiens. And so there's some connection between us and the processing of ochre that is a very long-standing relationship. The red ochre meant something to us. And for a very long time, it meant something to us. Painting with it meant something. And the red ochre seems to have represented the sacred, which, perhaps reminds us of Vine Deloria's wonderfully titled book, God is Red. God is Red. It's been noted among archaeologists that in the art of our prehistoric ancestors, the use of ochre is particularly intensive. I'm quoting now. It is not unusual to find a layer of the cave floor impregnated with a purplish red to a depth of 8 inches. The size of these ochre deposits raises the problem not yet solved. The coloring is so intense that practically all the loose ground seems to consist of ochre. One can imagine that the Aurignacians, the culture of these caves, regularly painted their bodies red, dyed their animal skins red, coated their weapons, and sprinkled the ground of their dwellings, and that a paste of ochre was used for decorative purposes in every phase of their domestic life. We must assume no less, still quoting, if we are to account for the veritable mines of ochre on which some of them lived. So, while we might not understand it, we cannot deny its significance. And it's in a context of the sacred. So again, I've taken us back 100,000 years in order that we might witness ourselves without the technological clutter. My room's cluttered with books, but in front of me is a lot of technological clutter. And like sometimes we need to clean it away so that we can see who we are without it. And looking back 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, and looking at the artifacts, I believe allows us to see ourselves in a different context, one that is perhaps more useful to us as we move into the future. And it's good to remember that in many ways, this technological clutter of modernity, is kind of like a proliferation of armor we've constructed against nature. And in some ways, against ourselves. So 100,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago, we can look at ourselves in situ, a natural being in nature. And I think it's worth saying that this youngling, because it's only 300,000 years ago that we show up, at least the only evidence of us, this youngling on a 4.5 billion year old planet, Homo sapiens, despite the dramatic changes in our material trappings, is not remarkably changed. Not in biological form or capacities. We have basically the same brain capacity and sophistication. And I want to make this point strong, because by now we should have learned the error of colonial thinking that led some of our human cultures, colonial cultures, to view others as being of lesser capacity, and thus justifying taking their lands or just walking over those cultures because they were somehow less sophisticated. This is patently false. We must actually presume the same mental sophistication for 300,000 years, only applied differently and in different circumstances. But the same brains, same anatomical features. Where does the sophistication go? It goes into different things. So the application here of that sophistication is greatly intriguing, especially for us who live such different lives. But it's what we see next that seems a game changer. So I was talking about 100,000 years ago. Roughly 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens leaves Africa. It stays in Africa too, but also leaves Africa. And leaves in a period of intense climactic shift. And very, very quickly covers the planet. Why is this interesting? Well, it's been illustrated before. If we look at the evolution of Homo sapiens on the planet as taking place over a single year, so we collapse, our own development down to a single year, it would look something like this. And here, I'll use an illustration again. So if January 1st is 23 million years ago, that's when we see the emergence of, the hominins. Then really February through October is just slow plodding evolution. But October 27th, 3 million years ago, we see the emergence of the genus Homo, human. Our first ancestors that are walking upright and using stone tools. But it's not until December 28th, 300,000 years ago, that we see Homo sapiens appear in Africa. And not until December 31st, 50,000 years ago, that Homo sapiens leaves Africa to populate the planet. So all the change of the last 50,000 years and the populating and even overpopulating of the planet has happened as if in a simple 24 hours. And this is not even the life of the planet, 4.5 billion years. That would make it like a minute. This is 23 million years ago when we see the hominins. So I don't know anybody that shouldn't be amazed at those statistics, at those numbers. Now, in 1994, a cave was discovered in the gorges of the River Ardèche in southern France. And in this cave, this is Chauvet Cave, the Chauvet-Pont cave, are some of the oldest known Paleolithic cave paintings in existence, approximately 33,000 to 37,000 years old. And on the walls of the cave are found red ochre handprints, perhaps not surprisingly, our old friend red ochre, and animals exquisitely drawn. And I'll say, as an artist, though they may look, using the words so-called primitive, an artist can tell that these are very confident lines, drawn in the dark by somebody that is not looking at the animal, drawing from memory, and they are anatomically correct. This is a capacity that we've largely forgotten. To be able to draw from memory this confidently is very profound. And so we see these animals drawn beautifully with these confident lines by artists who knew their bodies, the bodies of their models, in exquisite detail. And often they're drawn, in Chauvet Cave at least, as if in movement. It looks like they have multiple legs, but they're depicting movement. And they're positioned significantly on the cave surface itself determining or defining the course of some of the lines of the animals, which is to say, and we still see this today when people carve fetishes, indigenous people carve fetishes, that if they find a stone that suggests the shape of a certain animal, they merely enhance that. And we see something similar in the caves, that where the cave artist may have saw a line that suggested the animal, they assumed the animal was present and merely enhanced the lines and helped them emerge, as it were. Now, in the deepest reaches of Chauvet Cave, going, as far back as you can in the cave, is a chamber which has been described as kind of a holy of holies, a sanctum sanctorum. And in this holy of holies, there's a kind of protrusion coming from the ceiling of the cave, kind of a stalactite. And on it is drawn a kind of minotaur-like figure, embracing the hips and vulva of a female body. Yeah, and this is it's a theme that we've seen again and again. I think I have a picture of this. Let's see. So these are some of the rhinoceros that are drawn there. And here you can just see part of this protrusion from the ceiling and a minotaur-like figure embracing around the hips of a human female. And the vulva emphasized. And this is often called the Venus and the Sorcerer. The archaeologists tend to give these kind of whimsical names to things. Now, the paintings are sometimes dated thousands of years apart. Like, so you might have a painting on the wall of the cave, and just overlapping it, we can tell, is another painting drawn by another cave artist 5,000 years later. And so this cave was in continual use and for similar purposes. And it's clear that the paintings are meant to be seen in the dark by torchlight. And now if you imagine them drawing the animals in movement with the multiple legs and you're moving a torch, it can really seem like the animals are moving. And it's certainly necessary to take a torch to view the figures that are generally called the Venus and the Sorcerer. The question is, what's the purpose of these drawings? Personal expression? It's not likely. That's a very modern way of thinking and may have no reference here. So let me add a detail that might alter our view of the cave significantly. The evidence suggests that human beings never lived in this cave. There is no evidence of human habitation in the caves. None of the usual evidence of occupation, even though such caves would make ideal shelter for humans who lived exposed to the vicissitudes of nature in ways we can hardly imagine anymore. Even though they lived so exposed, they did not take advantage of living in the cave. Why neglect such a natural shelter, using it instead to make art, which can only be seen by torchlight? To me, it suggests that they valued the cave for something higher than shelter. Now think about that for people that lived exposed in a period which was very intense. You know, these are the cold times on the planet that we've heard about. And they're not taking advantage to make a fire in the shelter, to cook in the shelter. They make this art in the shelter. This is one of the major reasons why Joseph Campbell has spoken of these caves as cave temples. They were used as temples, not as habitation, or not for habitation. And what ritual might have taken place in the Holy of Holies of this cave before the Venus and the Sorcerer? We don't have any real evidence. But again, the imagery is not unknown to us. The woman embraced by the Minotaur and the association of the Venus figure and the bison, because it's really a bison or buffalo, is known from, and now I wish I had a slide of this, from modern images of Picasso. Picasso was nearly obsessed with this image. But we see it in other cave art. We see it in our mythology again and again. One of the best referential images for this is the Venus of Lascaux. Let's see if I have her. Here she is, carved into the limestone of a rock shelter in southwestern France. You see, most of what we're looking at is in southwestern France or in lower Germany. Seems to be a high population area for this kind of activity. And this carving is from approximately 25,000 years ago. It's about 19 inches high. It's limestone bas-relief of a human female figure. Again, if you look at one of her breasts, you can see something reddish there. Originally, she was probably painted in, guess what, red ochre. And so breasts, hips, vulva emphasized, left hand on her belly, and in her right hand is a bison horn. Some think that this may have been part of a hunting shrine. You know, as you know, below it were found other similar figures like her with the right arm bent, but often the hand was broken off so you couldn't see what was in it, but likely again a bison horn. Other figures that were found there were a male figure throwing a javelin, various animals, and maybe a birth scene. So possibly a hunting shrine that was somehow connected to procreation. Now, Joseph Campbell again writes concerning the Venus of Lascaux that here with her, he says, we are on the trail of the popular rites and myths of the earliest periods of human society of which we have record. And he points out, he has a wonderful book, a little dated now, called Primitive Mythology, in his enormous 3-volume series called The Masks of God. But at one point in there, he points out that in some myths that have, come down to us to our day, the position of stars that we know seems inaccurate. Unless you roll the star chart back to account for the precession of the planet every 26,000 years, and then the stars line up, which suggests that some of our myths are thousands upon thousands of years old and have held accurate information in them. And what he's saying here is that the motif of the Venus and the sorcerer, and something that we see in the Venus of Lascaux, is perhaps 30,000 years old and has survived in our art and myth, in particular, in a comparatively recently recorded Blackfoot myth of the buffalo and the maiden. So we, in that period of convergence, when cultures met and indigenous peoples were nearly eradicated, there were also some anthropologists who started to collect information. And this particular story, Campbell wants to suggest, may be up to 30,000 years old, or some version of it. And so I'll give you the myth, in a kind of a short form, not that short. It appears, and there's lots of evidence for this, that sometimes we would drive bison, which were one of our primary food sources, into a chute, into a kind of V-shaped chute, where they would be forced to fall over a cliff. And then, then it's a feast, a rather grisly feast, but a feast. And when it meant survival, it was a big deal for us. But in this myth, the buffalo or bison have gotten wise to the hunting traps of the humans. And so they seem to run into the chute and run right toward the cliff's edge. And once they get to the edge, they immediately stop and start to mill around like they're at a social. Meanwhile, the humans are watching them not fall off the cliffs, and they're starving. And so one day, a Blackfoot maiden has gone to get water, at the bottom of the cliff. And she looks at the buffalo milling around up there. And she says, "Oh, if you would only come down, I would marry one of you." Then, to her shock, the buffalo begin to pour over the cliff, falling to their deaths. Then, as if from nowhere, she's watching this terrifying scene, and, eyes huge, I imagine. Then, from somewhere next to her, suddenly appears a buffalo male. And he says, "All right, let's go." And she says, "Go where?" He says, "To get married, of course." And she says, "Oh, no, I didn't mean that." And he says, "Well, look, my people are dead here, so you're going to keep your promise." So the buffalo carries her off to be his wife. And later on, her people and her father come and find all the buffalo, and her father in particular is interested in where is his daughter. And he discovers the footprints of his daughter and a single buffalo male, and says, "I think my daughter's run off with a buffalo." So he tracks them until eventually he comes to the buffalo wallow, where the buffalo will drink and bathe. It's called a wallow. And he can see the buffalo lodges in the distance, but doesn't know buffalo are big and feisty if you get too close to them. So he doesn't know how he's going to get his daughter from among the giant buffalo. And at this point, luckily for him, a magpie comes by. And a magpie is often considered a kind of mystical bird. It goes between worlds. And the father says, help me out. Can you help me find my daughter among the buffalo and get this message to her that I'm waiting for her at the buffalo wallow? So the magpie flies off, finds the daughter, kind of goes to the teepee's edge and pokes his head in the teepee flap and whispers to her, hey, your father's waiting for you out by buffalo wallow. And just at that moment, the buffalo husband wakes and he takes off a horn and says, I'm thirsty, go get me some water. So great excuse to go meet her father. And she sees her father again. And he says, let's go, let's get out of here right away. And she says, no, they'll track us down and pursue us and kill us. Let me figure it out. I'll come up with a plan. So her father waits there and she goes back, and unfortunately for her, the buffalo husband smells another human on her. And so he takes his horn and he blows it and calls all the buffalo, and they stampede the wallow, crushing her father to bits until there's just almost nothing left. Seeing what's happened, the buffalo wife starts to cry and mourn for her father. And she's like, how can you have done this? And her buffalo husband looks at her and says, where were your tears when my people died? I'll tell you what, if you can bring your father back, I'll let you go. So she gives it a shot. She wants to get out of this marriage. She sends the magpie to find some bit of her father. And he comes back with a little bone fragment. And she puts it under a robe and begins a song. And the longer she sings the song, you can see a form shaping underneath the buffalo robe. And at a certain point, she checks it, and there's her father, but he's still dead. So she covers him back up again and keeps singing. And after a while, there's movement. She pulls it back, and her father's alive again. Seeing this miracle, the buffalo husband says, your people's magic is truly great. So why don't you do this for us? Why don't you bring us back? We who sacrifice our lives so that you might live. We will teach you our buffalo dance and buffalo song, and when we die, you will do the buffalo rite and resurrect us. Now, there's a lot to this story and more than I can talk about. But Campbell says that this is the basic hunting myth of the people that we once were, and it represents a kind of, quoting from him, a kind of covenant between the animal world and the human world. Covenant. The animal gives its life willingly, with the understanding that its life transcends its physical entity and will be returned to the soil or to the mother, as it were, Mother Earth, through some ritual of restoration. And this ritual of restoration is associated with the main hunting animal. So to the Indian of the American plains, it was the buffalo. On the northwest coast of what is now the United States, the great festivals have to do with the run of salmon. So it's not the buffalo. If you go to South Africa, it's the eland or the antelope. That's the principal animal. So there's a covenant between the human being and what is sometimes called the master animal. the primary animal connected to a people's survival, where the human hunter actually desires the good and well-being of the animal species that it hunts. And because of this, the animal sacrifices nobly for our good, only asking us to make its rebirth or continuance possible. You get the covenant. It's a covenant with our resources. We have to want the best for our resources. We can't afford the short-term thinking if we can use them up. We have to be praying for their restoration and doing something that takes care of them. In some ways, like, it's only in relationship to this myth and this understanding can we finally understand what a great sin it was to hunt the buffalo of the American West to near extinction, and in the way that we did. You know, we have a view of it, you know, where we know how wrong it was, but in another way, we don't know how wrong it was. It was a sin against our covenant, a covenant of maybe 50,000 years. Our agreement to care for the continuance of our master animal. You know, an animal that cares for us because it gives itself to us for our sustenance. And there's this understanding that the master animal has sent its own kind to be killed for our survival. Now, this is fascinating. Why would we think that? Why would they think that the animal taught us how to kill its kind and consented to it? It's a very foreign concept to us today. But we think that because the animal actually came and taught us, instructed us in how to kill it in a dream or a vision. You know, we know this from indigenous societies, that the animal comes and instructs you in how to deal with it, including how to hunt it. And so it's like, that was a willing sacrifice, you know. And why would it do that? Because the killing of this kind is not personal. It is us as nature doing what nature does. It was not considered out of the order of things, unlike the way we hunted the buffalo. It was not against the law of nature. The law of nature allowed for the kind of hunting and killing. But nature does have rules and laws, and those laws want all to thrive and have generations to follow, continuance. And so this is why it is considered a sin in hunting cultures to kill pregnant animals. You know, you never hunt the female that's pregnant, or which can be part of the continuance of that tribe of animals. Now, the question for us is, you know, as I brought up, is, do we have such a covenant with nature and the resources that take care of us? What is our, it may not be a master animal. And, you know, now as omnivores, you know, there are a number of resources that we take into our bodies, and number of resources that we use on the planet. Any number of which might be considered master resources. And do we have covenants with them? It doesn't seem that we do. But we utilized a different mind in that time. The French prehistorian Jean-Claude said this. Let's see. He suggested that the people of the Paleolithic likely had two concepts which change our vision of the world. They are the concept of fluidity and the concept of permeability. Fluidity, he says, means that the categories that we have, man, woman, horse, tree, etc., are fluid. They can shift. A tree may speak. A man can get transformed into an animal, and the other way around, given the right circumstances. And the concept of permeability is that there are no barriers, so to speak, between the world where we are and the world of the spirits. A wall can talk to us. A wall can accept us or refuse us. And we sometimes have that sense that we're being refused by objects. Jung certainly believed that objects were conscious or participated in consciousness. A shaman, for example, can send his or her spirit to the world of the supernatural, or can receive the visit inside him or her of supernatural spirits. If you put these two concepts together, you realize how different life must have been for those peoples from the way we live now. Imagine living in that consciousness, how it would change the way you think about everything. I think about it this way sometimes, like until the Industrial Revolution and the invention of the silvered glass mirror in 1835 and the general availability of mirrors, we mostly didn't know what we looked like. That is to say, others knew our faces and forms better in some ways than we did. Everybody knew what we looked like better than we did. And though we have mirrors now and take endless selfies, there's a kind of distortion, whether of the ego or the instrument. Which is to say, whether then or now, we cannot know ourselves by ourselves. Not entirely. We need each other. Humans are not independent. They're codependent in a positive sense. Interdependent. So why not embrace it? Being seen by all, because Jean-Claude there is describing a universe of mirrors. Being seen by all, speaking to and listening to all. And why not? Because after all, more eyes see more. Don't we want to see more? Sometimes we don't. Maybe we don't want to see ourselves as we are seen. It's inconvenient. That's why relationship is so hard. You're living with a mirror. And yet, the full human being takes advantage of that. And that's what makes love extraordinary. That you are seen accurately and still loved. Not for your presentation of self, but for who you actually are. So we have this capacity to know more, to listen to more, to be mirrored by more. Why do we resist? For all of this suggests that we cannot become ourselves by ourselves. We become ourselves together. That's the universe in which our Paleolithic ancestors seem to have lived. But what's the powerful magic that the buffalo discovered in the woman? He said, your people have a powerful magic. For this, I want to explore the art and artifacts of 4 more caves, and I'll go through them kind of quickly here. So in the Hohlefels cave in Germany was found the earliest known representation of the human form. This is it. This is the oldest known representation of the human form. It's about 40,000 years old. It's generally called the Venus of Hohlefels, with no head and no feet. Breasts, hips, and vulva emphasized. A goddess fetish sculpted from a mammoth tusk. And you can see, while there's no head, there's a little loop at the top where you could kind of string a thong through it and wear it around your neck. And often these figures are pointed at the bottom. Maybe you could plug them into the ground. In another cave, the Hohenstein-Stadel cave, near the southern rim of the Lohntal in Swabia in Germany, again in Germany, was found what's called the Lohenmensch. There's a little umlaut over that O. or lion-human figure, also approximately 40,000 years old. Now, this figure is anatomically male-bodied, but has a lion head, suggesting maybe the possibility of the kind of spiritual transmogrification into an animal master that Jean-Claude was referring to. And in the cave that's called Lascaux in southwestern France, we get something remarkable. These paintings are a lot newer, which is to say 17,000 years ago. And they depict a fecund world of healthy and pregnant animals. Many of the animals are pregnant. It's like an ideal existence where everything is healthy and thriving. Everyone is doing well, all the species, even when they're being hunted. And in a chamber within the cave is depicted, and we can see it here, a bird-headed shaman with an erection in trance. We won't go into the why of all of these things. And taking a bison's potency. And next to it is an atlatl, and atlatl is an old hunting instrument for throwing a spear. And there's a kind of bird-headed staff lying between them. And we can speculate about what this bird-headed shaman was, and what the purpose of this chamber was. One suggestion, actually made in the Seven Rites of the Lascaux, Black Elk tells how there's an inherent relationship between the two-leggeds, us, and the winged peoples, birds, because they are also two-legged. And we both fly. They fly with wings, and we fly with our minds. And so this, fairly recent text, Black Elk's Seven Rites, may be a key to interpreting why there's a bird-headed shaman here. Elsewhere in the cave, we have the so-called wizard beast of Lascaux, a chimeric creature, meaning a combination, seemingly composed of the characteristics of multiple animal species. It's like this animal does not exist. Horns and spots, and apparently pregnant, and yet perhaps also with a phallus. It's clearly a chimera, but representing what? Finally, also in southwestern France, in a cave discovered in 1914, which could only be entered, I think, which could only be entered through a very narrow passage, requiring one to crawl on one's belly an uncomfortably long distance in a very tight space before it opens into a great chamber. This is the Trois-Frères cave, whose paintings are dated to about 13,000 years ago, which is getting near now the time of our food revolution. On the walls of this chamber are many red and black dots, many paintings of animals like we saw in Chauvet Cave, and many of them have physical strike marks on them, like they've been hit with rocks or spears, the actual animal painting. And above all these animals, high up in the cave, walks or dances this enigmatic sorcerer of Trois-Frères, a kind of chimeric hunting shaman or master of animals in all their shapes. So what can we say about all this? The strike marks on the animals depicted in Trois-Frères certainly do not suggest training in hunting. You can do that much better in the light of day with the animals that you hunt every day. That suggests hunting magic, ritual. For similar reasons, the animals depicted are not likely the result, of painting for personal expression again. Again, it's likely it's a place that's hard to enter. It's likely a place of ritual and initiation. And presiding over it is this chimeric sorcerer. What's his secret? Now, all of these figures that we've seen, our Venus figures, for instance, are female-bodied, but they have no head and no feet. They seem to be ritual objects that can be, like I said, planted in the ground or worn around the neck with a leather thong. But no head really means no face. For our faces suggest our personal, unique attributes, our personas. Part of what makes us unique as human beings, as individuals, are our faces. So when there's no head, there's no personality. The Venus figures are impersonal, suggesting that the function of the body is more important here, not as an object to be objectified, but the body is sacred, beyond any individual woman. It's sacred, sacred possibility and function is being celebrated. That body is being celebrated as matrix or genetrix. It represents body magic. The sorcerer figures are male-bodied, but also have no head. Or which is to say, the heads are replaced by an animal head, whether a lion head or the bison head, or a deer rack on the head, which is to say they also have no faces. It's not, again, about unique personalities of an individual. It represents impersonal hunter magic. Thus, the wizard beast, the human being that can imagine, that can be many things, take on many personalities, get into the minds of many species, think as them, think like or be the animal. We can be the animal master. This is human mind magic. The two, body magic and mind magic, may be boiled down to creativity and imagination. Body magic and mind magic. Remember the description of the Homo sapiens, the potentially wise human, a hunter-gatherer with complex cooperative family and social structures, curious and inventive, evolving language, tools for survival, art, technology, religion, and passing on knowledge in unique ways. This is us. So I want us to appreciate this spiritual creativity and imagination as the tool of survival. Because when I think Star Wars, I'm thinking about how are we going to survive? How are we going to achieve a future? And it's important to dream for us now, especially in a time when so many have become nihilists or fatalists. I believe evolution is our ally in this. For evolution actually tells us so much that might give us hope as we seek that future. The evolutionary philosopher Gerald Hurd once pointed out that the human being is the only unspecialized or unfinished animal. We're non-specialized. So even our close cousins, the great apes of today, the gorilla, chimpanzee, or orangutan, have become highly specialized. If we had a common ancestor, that common ancestor probably had greater brain capacity than them. And now they are very adapted to particular environments. Their hands almost a foot, or particularly adapted for trees. They still have opposable thumbs, but not the dexterity of our hands. Our thumb goes places that theirs can't. And it allows us to manipulate tools, and they don't have the same brain capacity for conceiving of those tools. Our hands have conquered the planet, our hands and brains, at least to a point. But this brain needs longer to grow. You know, we don't spring from the womb and set about to tasks like other animals. We have the slowest maturation cycle, at least as I know, on the planet. That's to say, we've been able to master the planet precisely because we remain a child so long, protected from the necessities of growing up too fast and becoming too specialized, or protected from dying young and not developing to our full potential, i.e., into the wise human. And because we're so protected, we are not, in Gerald Heard's words, well finished. We're not well finished. We're kind of unfinished as an evolutionary product. We are, evolutionarily speaking, he says, a risky venture, tremendously vulnerable to the environment. Lots of exposed skin, which is also an advantage because it's an enormous sensorium, our exposed skin. And yet we're tremendously powerful in potential at the same time. So we're like the most vulnerable animal and the most powerful. We live on the precipice in that tension. And because we're unspecialized, not fitted to only one environment, not exclusively adapted to any particular task, we're unfinished with a kind of open-ended potential for growth. Thus, we are, in his words, the only animal with a future. Even if that future seems improbable to us now, you know, as we look at climate change or whatever. But from an evolutionary standpoint, life itself was improbable on this planet. We're told that the conditions had to be just right to make the odd glue stuff called colloid, you know, the Greek word for glue, to make that come together. And then the cookery had to be changed. Radiation had to be used, which would have been fatal at the start to us. An atmosphere which would suffocate us today was necessary to nurture the first, you know, half living beings. So if life is improbable, at the same time, where we can watch it, it's just as improbably successful. We are evolutionarily designed to make mistakes and to learn from our mistakes. And moreover, the life process of our planet, you know, based on our looking at it, where we can look at it, regularly cheats entropy, cheats the breakdown. It does this often. By reproduction, it throws off outworn husks and starts again, passing on new skills, mutations that help survival. And all this takes place not by making our bodies larger and larger, like the dinosaurs, but by making living creatures more intense and more nimble. Indeed, there's evidence to suggest that we have frequently reached dangerous moments and at the very last moment have tended to leap successfully into the future. It's kind of stupid, and yet it gives me hope. Like, why do we wait to the last minute? And that's my question. Why should we wait to leap? Maybe there's hope for us, but why wait for the leap? Why not dream a future to walk toward? I've always loved the word teleology. Teleology means the presence of the future in the present that calls us into that future. Presence of the future in the present that calls us to the future, helps us walk toward it. I think by reclaiming our deepest past, and this is why I've been talking about this, and our deepest identity, only then are we ready to walk into the future. We're unprepared right now because we don't know ourselves. We're trapped in a loop about our momentary identity. As has been pointed out by others, we are the first generations that can walk the floor of history and turn around to look upon its course. We're also then among the first generations who, knowing where we've been, can choose to evolve consciously. No other generations could really choose to evolve consciously because they didn't know where they came from. But we can determine where we're going because we can see where we've been. But we have a kind of problem to solve first. And I see I need to move through this quickly. We need to address, before we dream of a future, we need to address that we're already lost in our own heads. In his memoir of Water and the Spirit, Malidoma Some, who's from the Dagara tribe of Burkina Faso, I got to meet him when I was a young man, wonderful opportunity, tells of how he was taken from his village at 4 years old and educated in a Christian seminary until he was 20. Finally, he escapes, goes back to his village, no longer speaks his language, and he finds that upon returning, that he's now considered a threat to the village. So much so that one day his father sits him down to discuss what the elders in their council have said about him. That while he's not the first to return, he's the first to come back thoroughly initiated into the mind of the white colonizer, which means he thinks like his captors. To them, he's effectively white, which shows that it's not about race. They're threatened by a kind of spirit that is living in him. And they say, you're not here yet. Your body's here, and somehow you're not present. He's got a kind of disease or a programming. They say you carry something in you, something very subtle, something that comes from your contact with the whites. And it's changed you. And it threatens to change us. And it's not that you know how to read or write. You're going to make us like you. It's the disease of what's going on in you. So either you're going to die back into your primal self, your basic self, or you're going to make us die into you, your individuality. The first is human. The second is not. In the first, wisdom's at work. In the second, fear is at work. What is it that he carries from his initiation into white colonial society in Africa? His father calls it a ghost, something dead that does not like to confront anything having to do with life. That's what his father said. Now, most of us don't live close to the earth anymore. But I think this is really beside the point. We think that that's a big deal, and it is. But the bigger problem is that most of us don't live close to anything anymore. Part of our understanding of being human is that we are capable of a reflexive awareness and high abstraction. The latter allows us to problem solve and transfer information across domains. It allows us to create the technology we've created. And the reflexive awareness is the capacity to be aware of being aware, which is a special quality and essential for any nuanced contemplative life. But it can also be a rabbit hole of endless self-absorption. Even worse, we can project a reality of our own making onto the world around us. So much so that we can effectively live in exile from reality as it actually is. I'm going to give you an example. I meet you for the first time. You've been having a hard day and you're distracted and tired when we meet. And afterward, I walk away and say, what a jerk. Then I see you again from a distance another time, a week later, and I say to myself, there goes that jerk. Effectively reifying and locking you into that identity based on my previous judgment. We do this all the time. But it's to say, and this is the larger implication, we have the capacity to only interact with our projections with an interpretive filter that may have nothing to do with you. And if we don't check it, we may never genuinely meet anyone. You can live your whole life without ever meeting anyone, at least not as they actually are. And that's a tragedy. Or meet anything as it actually is. It's a terrifying possibility for us to never be truly present and meet what is actually in front of us, to see everything in reference to ourselves, to substitute an internal overlay for authentic meaning. Effectively, we live in exile from reality when we live in that projected reality. And we prevent others from being seen and met authentically. So we have an amazing capacity, but if unchecked, we may ruin the world in which we live with it. The world has to be met and loved as it is, or we'll use it for our own unrealistic ends and destroy it. The Lakota Sioux, after decades of fighting the United States Army, concluded that there was a basic difference between themselves and the Wasichu, which was their name for the non-indigenous peoples. They said that the Wasichu saw themselves as if standing outside of the hoop of nature and sought dominion over it. But nature and the full scope of being can never be fully known and controlled. The best a human being can do is venerate nature's power and use it respectfully to the best of our abilities. We cannot stand apart from nature because the human being is nature. We're the very fruit of the planet. Alan Watts said, just as the apple tree apples, the planet peoples. We're the fruit of the planet and within the sacred hoop of nature. What is within the hoop can't encompass the hoop because the hoop encompasses it. And thus, it's this arrogance, this arrogation or hubris that throws the planet out of balance. That's to say, because our minds can abstract the idea of the hoop, we fool ourselves into believing that we're outside of it, and thus try to manipulate it. This is why we so often speak of us and nature. A more ridiculous statement was never made. Us and nature, as if we were separate from it. And it's this kind of foolishness that endangers us. But if we trust evolution, and I do, then I must believe that there's purpose in the development of this high abstraction. We would not, certainly, we would not have the best of our technology without it, but technology without wisdom's hand upon it is a danger. It's been said many times that the sophistication of our technology is outdistance our maturity to use it. Leaving the internet equally available to neo-Nazis and peacemakers. Making bombs that can destroy the planet without acknowledging the unconscious, which controls the button. We're now faced with the decision of whether to be the knowledgeable human, Homo sapiens, or the wise human. So the naturalist Ernst Haeckel had a well-known saying that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Now, if that's true, it suggests that the arc of a human life is also reflected in the arc of our human species and how we're evolving and where we're going. And just as we go through a period of field consciousness as infants, not being able to distinguish ourselves from our environment, so did the human species. We didn't distinguish ourselves so much from our environment, it seems, at one point. But eventually, individuation has to occur in human life, which we see in teenagers and young people. And lately, in the youth of our species, like in our youngness as a species, it seems that that we are sharpening individuation and individualism to such a point that our individuality almost has no relationship to the whole anymore. It seems that this is where we're at. We've individuated into separation, the kind of postmodern madness, which means that perhaps we've reached a point or an end of a stage of development as human beings, a precipice from which we need to leap. Now, many of us today act as if everything exists to serve me and my individuality. But if we're to survive and take the blessing of that individuality with us, we have to start saying, my individuality exists to serve the planet or the whole. Among the Lakota, again, every object in existence has Tanwan, a kind of spirit in it. And every object is holy, Wakan. Among the ancient Romans, they called this a numen. A guiding spirit exists in all things, a holy spirit. And if we're the fruit of the planet, and the planet has made us as we are for its sake, for the sake of its health, because why would, nature do anything else but make things designed for it? Then we cannot afford to forsake the individual gifts we've been given as humans. It wants our individuality, but it doesn't want our individuality to be for us and destroy the planet, but to be for it, for its sake, not necessarily ours. It wants us to be us and not anyone else. It wants us to embrace our own Tanwan or Numen as power. But power among the Lakota meant sacredness, not the application of force. When I was 5 years old, in 1977, I sat in a movie theater with my mother and brother, and I had an experience of sacredness or magic. The voice of a sage who had sacrificed himself spoke to the main character in a moment of crisis, and I felt something profound, something I would not have words for until some 15 years later, when I read a book called The Idea of the Holy by Rudolf Otto, in which he spoke of the numinous, which is an experience characterized by a mysterium fascinans and a mysterium tremendum, which is to say the experience of the holy or numinous, he said, was in a tension between feeling compelled by fascinating mystery and at the same time feeling overwhelming power, so much so that it inspires fear. That is what I'd experienced and could not name as a child. Empire Strikes Back. So the movie, of course, was Star Wars. And it left a mark on me, an imprint of an ideal, the Jedi. And though I've playfully referenced Star Wars in my professional talks through the years, there is some aspect of this play with fiction that I think is serious, or rather which touches upon something real. Because the boy of 5 had a real experience while watching a play or a movie depicting mythological motifs that are long known and celebrated. And he had been captured by the latest iteration of an archetype, the masterful sword-wielding monk and wizard, transformed by contemplative disciplines into a sage who could meet the world's needs. I wanted that in some primordial way. And I liked swords, what can I say? I was 5. And by the time I was 8, and saw The Empire Strikes Back, George Lucas's Joseph Campbell-inspired mythological victory was complete. I began to read and study mythology, to study the history of religions, philosophy, great literature. And always, I suspect, in my heart of hearts, on the trail of what I had known as a 5-year-old boy. That, whatever that was somehow real. And not the 30-foot vertical jumps or manipulating objects, in the air with my mind, but mastery and coordination of body and mind, sagehood, to be something different than what I saw around me in my tough neighborhood, something noble and whole. Today, I'm a religion scholar, but it's clear to me that religions are breaking down. The great monasteries are closing for having no new vocations. The great cathedrals are nearly empty for having few congregants. Neither of them want the interest of tourists, but that's nearly the only interest there is. The societal structures that once sustained these institutions just no longer exist. I love these places. I love discussing medieval religion, philosophy. And I like to think I've made them interesting to new generations. But those generations are wary of entering into relationship with them. And I think perhaps rightly, because the paradigm of these institutions, the paradigm they represent, is no longer the paradigm of these generations that are arising. So I began to think, why not dream a new religion? Why not play seriously, as the immortal Bruce Lee used to tell his students? Why leave Star Wars for entertainment or cosplay at Comic-Con? Why not explore the metaphor, the myth of it? After all, the thing that it inspires in us is actually real. And the truth is, we made Star Wars. George Lucas and all his co-conspirators, that's just us. And we made it with the very mind magic that makes us so unique, there from the beginning, and from which we once forged a covenant with Mother Nature. Everything in Star Wars was made by us. Everything conceived is conceived by us. It is real, according to the medieval philosopher Nicholas of Cusa, because it is conceived by the posse of the mind, the possibility, the mind's capacity to conceive, which has as its roots posse ipsum, possibility itself, which was how Cusa spoke of God. If it is conceived, it exists. The manner of its existence may be distinguished from one existence and another, but its existence cannot be denied or dismissed. It is conceived, so it exists. For me, Star Wars represents spiritual futurism, a spiritual futurism. Like, I have colleagues that are having an extraordinary discussion today of Afrofuturism, redefining the landscape of the Black experience in America by allowing themselves to dream freeform without the constructs of history that have shaped their existence, but going freeform and free from constraints, and exploring a way of being Black in America that is creative and dynamic. And I'm inspired by them. And I want to propose this for religion, that it allow itself to dream freeform, free from constraints, of a future of possibility, to wonder and perhaps even ask AI art generators, what Sufi sheikhs would look like as Jedis in the future, or Tibetan Buddhist monks. Because when we conceive it, it exists, and we can walk toward it. At the beginning of his Glass Bead Game, Hermann Hesse attributes a quote to somebody called Albertus Secundus. As far as I know, Albertus Secundus doesn't exist. But the quote is interesting. In a certain sense, for light-minded persons, non-existent things can be more easily and irresponsibly represented in words than existing things. For the serious person, it is just the reverse. Nothing is harder, yet nothing is more necessary than to speak of certain things whose existence is neither demonstrable nor probable. The very fact that serious and conscientious people treat them as existing things brings them a step closer to existence and the possibility of being born. That is to say, a lot of people speak blithely and casually of imaginary things. No big deal. Even more casually of them than their ordinary lives. But for others, to speak of those things whose existence is not demonstrable is serious and important, and not casual at all, but may bring them closer to existence. For, as Nicholas of Cusa defined God as posse ipsum, possibility itself, the possibility that is the heart of all being, the substrate of all existence, then all the possibility and impossibility that there may be is in the hands of God as possibility. And if it's been allowed to be present in our dreams, then I think possibility is spoken, and we should leap into the future with it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you for carrying us into the possibility that you have created and that we've been allowed to step into. I'm going to ask just one question. What is offered at this time as a covenant from nature?
Well, if we take the model of the past, I think nature has been so generous with us, and it continues to be generous with us. It's just we've taxed it past limits, and there's a protest from it. You know, a calling for recognition. I think it keeps its covenant, but a covenant is reciprocal. And so I would say that maybe its covenant remains and is still offered. The question is, will we miss the moment? You know, will we push it too late? But I think our ancestors have shown us the way to live with our resources, to love them as sacred, to accept their generosity and acknowledge it as generous by cultivating as stewards of the planet its needs, prioritizing its needs, because we can't live without it. We've unfortunately made ourselves a cancer on the planet, you know, a rogue cell that lives only for itself, ultimately destroying its host. I think the planet has kept its covenant, and we have not, because we placed ourselves outside of the hoop of nature, merely because we can abstract the idea of nature. But we've lost relationality. And so I think there's a hand from nature waiting for us to reach back and take it.
Does the maiden say anything to the buffalo in the Blackfoot myth when the buffalo marvels at her magic? Does she say anything back to the buffalo?
I think it's more like a discourse from him after that. This is what you should do, and this is what's going to happen. And then he teaches her the ways of the buffalo rites. And then what's told in the story, as I've seen it, is that this is then the origin of the buffalo dance and song among the Blackfoot, and then there is a Buffalo society that holds those rights. And so I think it kind of ends there. It's because it's a kind of origin story for why we do what we do.
And I believe you see, I ask as if it could give us some of the imagined future as to what a prescient myth maiden might have illuminated for us to walk toward. So perhaps from your inspirational teaching and inquiry, what we hear is it's our call to be the voice of the maiden.
Yeah, she makes the covenant. She reached out. She got herself into a thing that she was maybe not prepared for. But once she was in it, she stood well for us and came out by showing, by demonstrating her potential, came out with a secret of survival for more than one species. And on a permanent basis. It's her bravery that does that. Now, bravery is sometimes a little foolhardy, but I think she has given us something. And I think nature does, in the larger sense, admire our capacity and created our capacity to shepherd. But when you have this reflexive awareness and abstracting consciousness, it has also the possibility of destroying itself. So if I would bring it back, I would say, I would come back to that one line. We are now at the moment of deciding what Homo sapiens means. Knowledgeable human or wise human?
Thank you for offering us insight and the potential to be wise. Very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.